This digital assessment guide is a companion to the assessment presented in the module handbook. It breaks down everything you must do in order to pass the module and to help you submit an excellent assessment. The structure allows you to skip to the relevant parts of the assessment so you can dip in when working through the assessment. However, I advise that you listen to it in full first so you grab all of the essential information. The module assessments are designed to deliver a full experience in which you're able to write reflective reports, write to a specification and to work in groups to apply teaching methods and present them as a team. There are two formative assessments, which are those that do not count towards your overall mark but do add to your learning experience and feed elements into your final summative assessments. These are your philosophy of teaching submission and your final group presentation. There are also two summative assessments, a 1,000-word essay or report covering Learning Outcome 1 and a 4,000-word essay or report covering Learning Outcomes 2 to 4. Learning Outcome 5 applies to both of these summative assessments. We'll now go through each of these in turn. The philosophy of teaching is the first formative assessment. We start with this task as we often don't get the chance to deeply reflect on who we are as teachers. Why do we do what we do? What influences have shaped who we are as teachers? Or for those yet to teach, think we will be as teachers? This initial deep reflection can guide us towards things we would like to discover or change about our practice. It also starts the deep reflective approach required for the summative assessment. For the submission of the philosophy of teaching, you have a number of options. You've got a blog or diary post, a video log or diary. This can be individual or maybe with another person from the group discussing your philosophies together. It's up to you. A traditional reflective report, which is fine too, or literally anything else that allows you to convey the information effectively. We had one of our previous students, a dance lecturer, do her philosophy of teaching literally in the form of interpretive dance. So when we say anything, we mean it. The philosophy of teaching reflection should be 1,000 words or equivalent, plus or minus 10% given that it's formative. Note that video logs are on average 5 to 8 minutes per 1,000 words. Video logs will also need references where necessary. References are not actually a necessity in this piece, but if you refer to specific books or readings that have influenced you in your teaching, in this case you would include a reference. As a formative assessment, it should be discussed with your PAT and submitted to the Dropbox. It's not formally marked. The feedback will come through the formative discussion with your PAT about the philosophy. There is a useful video on Blackboard that I've linked to here as well, and that you may use. It just gives a really nice overview of the kind of things you need to think about for your philosophy of teaching. For the Learning Set group presentations, you'll be asked to form groups of between 4 and 6 participants. In this group, you'll identify one teaching method or pedagogical approach or technology to facilitate learning and test it out as a group. It's understood that all group members may not have the opportunity to deliver sessions within the allocated weeks. However, at least 2 group members, preferably more, should apply the chosen method or technology, and the other group members should support, plan and facilitate where possible. You'll then present this to your peers and some staff using the presentation method or approach that you feel is fit for purpose. Keep it flexible to allow some creativity. Last year, some groups decided to model the approach whilst talking about it. Others simply presented the method and shared their experiences. Others presented experience ending with a how-to guide. All these and any other creative approaches are valid and useful approaches. This chosen method may be the aspect of teaching that you highlight for your final summative submission, or you may choose to reflect on something completely different for that submission. Ultimately, your only limitation is that you have 15 minutes. How you choose to use it is up to you and your group. The purpose of this assessment is working in groups. Well, it can be rewarding and challenging, and it also allows you to analyse some of your peers' teaching practice and share experiences. It allows you to share these with others and to develop your understanding of your chosen teaching method that you're going to present. Previous cohorts have also stated they felt it was good experience to know what their students experience when working in groups. Summative Assessment 1 covers Learning Outcome 1 and asks for a discussion of the nature of higher education environment within which you work, critically analysing the key influences on your practice and the practice within your department. I'm emphasising the fact that it needs to relate to how these environmental factors impact and influence on you, as it's a common mistake that previous students have made. They focus on the external factors in higher education without actually relating it to the impact on their own practice, subject and environment. The environmental factors can include national and international, so it might be political, economic factors, or local, things like cultural, institutional and departmental factors. But you don't have to include all of them. The main thing is what is highlighted here. It's the key environmental and external influences. So you may briefly mention all of them, but then explain why you're concentrating on just a few as the key influences. The purpose of this assessment is to ask you to consider and understand these external and internal influences on your practice, as understanding these factors can help to understand the pressures that the institution and the heads of department and programme leaders might face, which can often mitigate some frustrations when staff understand the reasoning behind certain decisions. You may choose to speak to senior staff to gain their perspective of the pressures if you wish, although this is not a necessity for the assignment. This is a maximum of 1,000 words, so you'll have to write succinctly. You'll submit online. This Part 2 summative assessment is a 4,000 word essay or report that addresses learning outcomes 2, 3 and 4. You're required to reflect on and critically review an aspect of your practice. This could involve designing, planning and evaluating learning activities that might range from something very specific such as a lecture or a seminar or a workshop to the consideration of a series of interconnected activities, for example lectures or seminars that you're teaching. You may choose to consider how you teach and or support learning, how you assess and give feedback to learners, or how you develop effective learning environments and approaches, and importantly, how your students learn within their specific environments. You may also review activities such as supervising students on dissertations or placements. It's important that you evaluate whether the use of technology could enhance your practice that you're critically reviewing. It's essential that you involve other people to cover learning outcome 3, such as your own students and peers, to help you reflect. From this critical review reflection, you should identify how you're going to improve the activity you're focused upon, which covers learning outcome 4. You should also set out any professional development needs arising from this review and reflection. This submission should have a focus on your chosen aspect of teaching, which should be clearly articulated and described. Critical analysis of the literature, methods and approaches should be related back to your own practice where possible. There should be a final critical analysis of your own practice. This final submission allows you to bring all of your discussion, reflection and learning from the module together, identifying your strengths and developing confidence, whilst also identifying areas and ideas for personal development, bringing in the views of others. Obviously you have the learning outcomes in your module handbook, but I have them here so you can see how they directly link to your assessment. You're asked to discuss the nature of the higher education environment in which you operate and critically analyse its influence on your practice. This clearly covers the expectations of the 1,000 word summative Part 1 assessment. We then have learning outcome 2. Explain and critically analyse, drawing upon relevant literature, the factors influencing students' learning experience, both generally and in their subject, and how it impacts upon approaches to teaching and assessment, including the appropriate use of learning technologies. Learning Outcome 3. Critically evaluate your practice utilising a collaborative approach that draws upon peer and student feedback and takes into account personal and professional values and the values of others. So you can start to see how these are linking in to the second part of the summative assessment. And Learning Outcome 4. Demonstrate that they're able to identify and critically analyse different ways of improving their practice and their students' learning. So these three learning outcomes, 2 to 4, relate clearly to the requirements of the 4,000 word Part 2 assessment. You may choose to structure your assessment into 3 sections to ensure you're covering these learning outcomes if you wish. But again, you have the flexibility to decide on how you present the information, in this case as an essay or a report. Learning Outcome 5 is to demonstrate the ability to keep to the assignment guidelines set out in the module and programme handbooks. This relates to Part 1 and 2 and just means that you're following the guidance, including the necessary appendices and following the suggested word count. It's a course requirement specified by the HCA that you're observed by an expert peer in order to authenticate the practice that you're reflecting on in this assessment. One teaching session of the participant's choice, of your choice, is observed by an expert peer. An expert peer in this case refers to staff who have experience of the UK PSF and will usually be staff with a fellowship or senior fellowship with the HCA or senior staff from your department. After the teaching observation has taken place, the observer sends a written report to the participant using the standard faculty teaching observation template or the one provided by us on Blackboard in week 1. The observer's report should be included in the final submission in the appendix. If for any reason you feel you're struggling to arrange an expert peer observation within the time frame of the module, then please speak to the module leader or to your PAT and we may observe you instead. There are a number of essential aspects for inclusion in the abstract, which are also explained in the module handbook. They are including a copy of your philosophy of teaching. Learning Outcome 3 asks you to critically evaluate your own practice utilising the collaborative approach that draws upon peer and student feedback. This might include peer and or student review, and may also include reviewing yourself through recorded teaching sessions. Any useful data or analysis from this process may be included in your appendix. However, please do not include any raw data that might identify students or peers unless they've formally given consent to allow you to do so. Your expert peer observation documentation should be included in the appendix too. You may use the observation forms we provide on Blackboard or your faculty peer observation forms. You should include a self-assessment as to how you feel you've met the learning outcomes and criteria. This may just be a table with the learning outcomes in one column and an explanation as to how you feel you've met them or addressed them in the next column. No more than a page for this with all the learning outcomes. It's also worth taking a detailed look at the assessment criteria and the language used, especially in the distinction column, which we assume everyone aspires to, but some staff do tell us, no, I just want to pass, which is absolutely fine too. For Learning Outcome 1, the key words here are a thorough and systematic coverage of the factors from the higher education environment, as well as a well-developed critical analysis of how these factors influence your practice. For Learning Outcome 2, which relates to your students' learning experience, I've again highlighted the distinction elements. Here we see that it's important to give a clear and succinct picture of the aspects of practice that you're reflecting on. This is an area where students always lose marks as they lose focus on the aspect of practice they identify or do not explain it at all. You should also engage with the literature at more than a surface level, and then you can effectively synthesize disparate sources of information, making links between them that can link to your practice and your students' learning. Learning outcome 3 relates to critical analysis of your practice. It notes that you'll make use of a collaborative approach, which we've mentioned a number of times now, using feedback from others to enable you to reflect. It also asked for evidence of a reflexive practice. The difference between reflective and reflexive is subtle, but in brief, reflection is a singular thing. We individually reflect on something that's happened. Reflexivity is broader and takes into account reflection in practice and also the thoughts, feelings and beliefs of others to give a deeper reflective process. Learning outcome 4 relates to the identification of areas for improvements. The distinction band asks for detailed and critical examination of a range of options to improve your practice and students' learning. You should also identify your chosen method for improvement with clear justifications. As shown, it should also include reflections on improvements from the chosen aspect of practice, but may also identify, through the reflection, more general ways of improving your practice. Learning Outcome 5 simply asks that your assignments professionally presented in line with the guidelines and stick to the 5,000 word limit, which is the 1,000 words for part 1 and 4,000 words for part 2. Please note that this 5,000 words does not include the philosophy of teaching, and you're expected to reflect before submission on how well you've met the learning outcomes stated. This isn't included in your word count either. Key dates are all shared in the sessions on Blackboard and in the initial session presentation. Your final philosophy of teaching will be submitted online. This will be through Turnitin if it's a written account, or Panopto if it's a video reflection. Talk to us if it will be in a different format to either of these. The final submission of part 1 and 2 will be online also. You should ensure that each submission is one document. Where you've got multiple items in your appendices, make sure that they're all popped into one document before you submit. Other things to consider is that you must start to arrange your expert peer review to ensure that this is done in time for you to reflect on it in your final assessment. Other peer reviews or student feedback will also need to be considered in terms of when these will happen. We've also got this final checklist, which is useful, which you can look back on when you get to the point of submission. This final key checklist just gives you something to check off before you submit to make sure you've got everything in there. Firstly, as this is a level 7 course, it's essential that you're demonstrating critical reflection or critical analysis of the literature. It's important that you evaluate whether the use of technology could enhance the aspect of practice that you could critically review at some point in your Part 2 submission. It's essential that you'll involve other people, such as your own students and peers, to help you reflect. This links to Learning Outcome 3. The accreditation of the course by the HEA notes that your practice must be authenticated, meaning that you'll be observed by an experienced staff member who's a fellow or senior fellow of the HEA. As many of you are on probation, you'll be observed anyway, and it's likely this will be an expert peer observation. You must arrange with your manager or equivalent to ensure that you're observed as soon as possible, so you can gather the feedback for your reflection. If your manager is not an experienced teacher or lecturer and not a fellow of the HEA, you may be observed by your PAT or the PGCERT module leaders. Please ensure you keep copies of the observation sheets, as these will be your evidence and will be submitted in your appendices. From the critical review reflection, you should identify how you're going to improve the aspect of practice that you focus upon, and you should also be setting out any professional development needs. Please ensure the aspect of practice you're writing about is clearly articulated. And finally, as mentioned earlier, you must ensure that you're meeting all of the learning outcomes. Feel free to include a brief written reflection at the start or end of your assessment where you believe you've addressed each learning outcome. This is not included in your word count, but it's definitely a useful exercise for you to make sure that you're covering all the necessary aspects. It's also a really good tool to use with your own students. Okay, so we want to learn from the mistakes of past students. So this is where I feel students have made the mistakes in past that hopefully we can learn from by sharing what's happened. So listen to the whole digital assessment guide and take on board each point. I didn't know when you're submitting your assessment doesn't really count when it's explicitly stated in the digital assessment guide that you're given in the first few weeks. So please do make sure that you take the time to listen to the whole thing. Take the time to reflect at the end on where in your assignment you've met each learning outcome and explicitly state this in a reflection or table. Ensure that you clearly identify and articulate the aspect of practice you're reflecting on. Look at the assessment criteria. We use this to mark. We cannot give you a distinction if you do not ensure you're writing to the criteria in the distinction category. Engage with your personal academic tutor. You can arrange a draft discussion with your PAT and show them either 1,000 words of work in progress or a 1,000 word plan for the assessment structure. Those who engage with their PAT in some way always do better than those who don't engage with them at all. However, ensure you agree a plan of action with your PAT. You cannot expect to turn up the day before submission without warning and expect them to give feedback on drafts. They also have holidays, conferences and other external work happening, so agreeing dates for drafts etc. in advance is a good approach. Thanks for listening, and as ever, please email us if you have any questions or pop over and see us for a chat in the lodge. Thank you.